Typically in Europe, extended families were very popular. That's where newly married couples lived with the bride or groom's family. Usually there were 3 or 4 generations in the household, and that meant that they lived with their brothers and sisters. This provided security in agrarian peasant economies.
In nuclear families, couples would establish their own households when they married. They would raise their children away from their parents. The extended family was destroyed in Europe by the Industrial Revolution. In the few cases where parents lived with their children, the older parents moved in instead of the children moving in with the parents.
The average person, who was neither rich nor aristocratic, married surprisingly late, many years after reaching adulthood and many more after beginning to work. Moreover, a substantial portion of men and women never married at all. The custom of late marriage combined with a nuclear family household was a distinctive characteristic of European society. Why was marriage delayed? The main reason was that couples normally could not marry until they could support themselves economically. The land was still the main source of income. The peasant's son often needed to wait until his father's death to inherit the family farm, and the peasant daughter and her family needed to accumulate a small dowry to help her fiance buy land or build a house.
Many young people worked within their families until they could start their own households. Boys plowed and wove, girls spun and tended the cows. However, many others left home temporarily to work elsewhere. In the towns, a boy might be apprenticed to a craftsman for 7 or 14 years to learn a trade. During that time, he would not be permitted to marry. In most trades, he earned little and worked hard, but if he was lucky, he might eventually be admitted to a guild and establish his economic independence. More often, the young man would drift from one job to another.
What changed is girls left their families to work at an early age and in large numbers. Usually they worked in another family's household, and even middle-class families often sent their daughters into service. These girls worked hard, but they didn't really have independence. Usually the employer paid the girl's wages directly to her parents. The girl found herself with many tasks, including cleaning, shopping, cooking, and caring for the baby. One exploitation was Varka, the Russian servant girl in Chekhov's chilling story Sleepy, who, driven beyond exhaustion, finally quieted her mistress's screaming child by strangling it in its cradles. Scary. There were also physical mistreatment of the girls. They were called various names, such as bitch and whore, and other names.
The significance of these girls leaving their families is the enormous pressure from the seducers. In theory, domestic service offered protection and security within a new family that the young girl would be leaving home for, but in reality, she was then exploited and became easy prey for the master or his sons or even his friends. Men of the upper classes felt perfectly free to exploit women who were at their mercy. If the girl became pregnant, she was quickly fired and thrown out in disgrace to make her own way, and prostitution and petty thievery were often harsh consequences of unwanted pregnancy.
Before 1750, only 1 out of every 20 children was a bastard child. For example, in France, less than 1% of children were born out of wedlock. However, premarital sex was clearly commonplace. 33% of children in one English village were conceived before marriage. This shows that pregnancy set the date for marriage. Often, this was a result of community controls. Traditional villages had a pattern of cooperation and common action. For example, irate parents and anxious village elders, indignant priests, and authoritative landlords would all combine to pressure any young people in the face of unexpected pregnancy to get married.
There were many punishments for people who had illegitimate children. Some of them were kind of interesting. For example, some of the overly brutal spouse beaters and the adulterers were put atop a donkey backwards and forced to hold its tail up while riding. They paraded the person through the town while shouting their misdeeds.
Come on, Dougie!
Whoa! Insulting midnight serenades were often a punishment in Europe.
A final form of punishment was the splattering of vegetables on one's doorstep.
The community was able to control illegitimate births through the tradition of marriage. However, after marriage, couples had many children. Although birth control was not unknown, it was mostly used to prevent venereal disease, although coitus interruptus was used also.
In the second half of the 18th century, the pattern of late marriage and few births out of wedlock began to change and break down. The number of illegitimate births soared between about 1750 and 1850 as much of Europe experienced an illegitimacy explosion. About 36% of all babies were being born out of wedlock by 1840. Small towns and villages experienced less startling climbs, but increases from a range of 1 to 3% initially to 10 to 20% between 1750 and 1850 were commonplace. This is because fewer young women were abstaining from premarital intercourse, and more important, fewer young men were marrying the women that they got pregnant.
Several things led to the growth of illegitimacy. First, the growth of the cottage industry created new opportunities for earning a living. These opportunities were not tied to the land. After 1750, however, courtship became more extensive and freer as the cottage industry grew. It was easier to yield to the attraction of the opposite sex and fall in love. Second, the needs of a growing population sent many young villagers to towns and cities in search of temporary or permanent employment. Mobility in turn encouraged new sexual and marital relationships, which were less subject to village tradition and resulted in more illegitimate births. Promises of marriage from a man of the working girl's own class often led to sex, which was widely viewed as a part of a serious courtship. Many soldiers, day laborers, and male servants were no doubt sincere in their proposals, but their lives were also insecure, and many hesitated to take on the heavy economic burdens of wife and child.
Thank you for listening to our podcast this evening. This message brought to you by
Insulting midnight marinades. Oh my god.
This might take like 20 takes. Okay.
That was close, you almost had it.
How do you say venereal disease?
Venereal, that's right.
No, I meant not laugh. Okay.
Oh, I was like, how do you say it? I was like, that's right.